Could you speak to some of the biggest challenges that you have faced during your career?
Well, talking earlier on, I think the first major challenge I had was when I was transferred from this organization I was working in, which was basically, it had evolved. I had a job where I was working with retirees and employees on environmental projects and putting out all kinds of literature about that for anybody who would listen. Some people. But ultimately I got transferred into media relations, which is the beginning of a public relations career, and for many very excellent people, the fulfillment of a public relations career. But I knew nothing about media relations. I mean nothing. And I tried to learn. At that time, I was the only woman in that part of the group. And everybody else had been a journalist. And I hadn't been a journalist either, so I was terrified. And ultimately, I thought I would fail, and my boss said he really started to worry about me, that I was paralyzed. And ultimately, I decided that one of AT&T's problems was that because they were staffed by print journalists, they had no television public relations at all. And so I created a television approach and a little group, and hired a television specialist and started getting us on things like the Today Show and what have you. And of course there were 10 million stories that were ready to be told because we had never done anything proactively for television. And that was sort of the beginning of finding that one of the real ways to make a difference in a large organization was to create as opposed to follow the well-beaten path. And of course, between the years of the 70s, the late 70s, the early 80s, when AT&T was broken up, and from then on, it was all about adapting to change, all about adapting to a new world. And so anyone who was not complaining about the way it was, but was ready to say, whoa, there's opportunity here to do something new, I think was more valuable. And that was the biggest challenge for me, was finding those ways. Later on, when I was in charge, the very, very largest challenges were, on the one hand, trying to help senior management adapt to the various things that those of us who have a broad view of the world could see needed to be done, other than the technical and financial aspects of the business. But we got into trouble, not often, but sometimes. And I think the most difficult times I had to overcome were two catastrophic events I was involved in. One, when our foundation, for a variety of reasons I won't bore you with now, decided to stop funding Planned Parenthood. And within a couple of weeks, our wonderful relationship with this organization, which had gone on for 16 years, we were their longest funder, turned into a cataclysmic public battle with Planned Parenthood nationally, taking ads saying hang up on AT&T. We had threats of boycott. It was just horrible, absolutely horrible. And worse, because those of us who had managed this decision were quite sympathetic to it, but for a variety of reasons having to do with the company policy and their policies, were unable to do this through our foundation. But the thing I learned was that there are public issues that are so big, so divisive, so potent, so emotional, so like tornadoes, that it doesn't matter how big and powerful you are as a business or an institution. It doesn't matter whether or not right is on your side. It doesn't matter whether you've planned well. You step into one of these issues, and you are like a little rowboat in a raging sea, because the big national, public, cultural, emotional, patriotic, religious kinds of issues just cut you to pieces, and you bleed everywhere. And I learned, because I fell into another one maybe 10 years later, I learned that these were to be fudged, if possible, in such a way that you would not become a target, and that if you were going to have to deal with one of these issues, you needed to develop not just good constituency relations, which we had, but you needed to understand strategy in a very real way, and company character, and issues management at a very, very high level, or the reputational implications were just awful. We had, for 10 years following this decision, we had proxy statements regarding the funding of this organization. I mean, it was just so beyond belief. So there are crises and there are crises. And I learned a lot about crisis management through the course of our career, because God knows we had plenty of them.
I know that in 2002 you delivered a speech when you were inducted into the Page Society Hall of Fame, referencing the monkey crisis during your days at AT&T.
That was the analog to the Planned Parenthood crisis. The big lesson I took away from that, just a brief stage setter, that was a case where an absolutely wonderful, diversity-minded, socially responsible editor of our company magazine, which went out to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, in the course of a story on international business, commissioned from a freelance artist some illustrations. One of those illustrations, which was about 1.5 inches, 2 inches square at most, in black and white, had little tiny figures on each continent. And say for Europe, they had like a little Dutch girl, a little Dutch outfit. And on Africa, they had a monkey. This was immediately interpreted as a racist statement. As it happens, because this illustration was so small, from a freelance artist, and considered so irrelevant to the general content of the magazine, it never went through the normal clearance processes. But when discovered, after the magazine was printed, the editor of the magazine realized that this was potentially, again, stepping into one of these gigantic national issues. And so she issued an apology on behalf of the magazine, which of course called its attention to 300,000 people. And we tried to do a variety of things to manage this, because AT&T was really known for its diversity policies. So we were considered a leader in this field. Somewhere along the line in this, we had what can only be described as a stroke of really lousy luck. And the Black Congressional Caucus held their annual meeting in Washington. The Washington Post picked up this cartoon, enlarged it several times, put it on page 1, and it was delivered to the front door of every black member of Congress. And all of a sudden, we had thought this couldn't possibly get bigger, and it was bigger yet, and totally awful. What I learned from this, other than the usual crisis management issues of emotion, were two big lessons. The first one is that on these highly emotional, highly divisive issues, the building of trust is very fragile. And you may think you have achieved trust and credibility, but there's no such thing as deep-rooted trust and credibility from outside a particular stakeholder group on an issue like this. And it is very easily destroyed and very, very, very hard to rebuild once fractured. The other lesson I learned was what it feels like to be on the line yourself, because I had to do some terrible things during that crisis for the company. I ended up doing something that seemed impossible at the time, which is I had to close down the magazine. It had become a national symbol of racism. And I had to relieve the editor, who was a paragon of social responsibility. But as I said to my organization in a meeting and a broadcast, I believe with breaking voice, it was all about accountability and the appearance of accountability. And there is no way to go part way on accountability on issues of this kind. And the sooner you do that, probably the easier it is. So I know what it feels like when we ask our CEOs to do something like this, because this was in my shop. The accountability was ultimately mine. As part of this, I offered up my own resignation to my chairman, who didn't take it, but it was very, very painful. And it reminds you, because it was so painful, that as you ask your senior leadership to step up in these situations, I knew from that day on what it feels like. It ain't easy, and that's why it's so often avoided, because it is personally so painful in these situations to step up and say, not only did I make a mistake, but I have to do things that just, break my heart and may do damage within my company and to employees or what have you in order to make all this right. So, nasty lesson.
What do you feel is the future of the public relations industry? How do you think that the industry is evolving now with everything that you've talked about in terms of technology and the global economy? What's the future for the public relations industry?
I think it is just hitting its stride. I really do. I think the changes we're seeing in the business world, in technology, and globalization speak to why institutions need public relations. Institutions are struggling to deal with these rapidly multiplying constituencies. They are struggling to deal with the fact that everybody knows everything about them. They are struggling to understand how to fit into a multicultural world, and by that I mean globally as well as the tremendous demographic change here. This is what we do. This is what we bring to the table. So I think as I look at what some of the agencies are doing in terms of developing new mechanisms for understanding how to use the new tools, how to deal with the transparency, as I look at the expertise we've developed in crisis planning, when people fall into crises every Tuesday and Thursday nowadays because of the way media works, when I look at the explosion, the fragmentation of media and citizen journalism and what have you, and blogging, when I look at the skills we're developing and how to measure the impact of what we do and reputation, hey, we're about to be in the golden age. The past was truly just prelude.